Hey everyone, welcome to a special episode of Why Should I Trust You? Now, some of you may have heard the recent headlines that the FDA refused to review Moderna's application for its new flu vaccine, a vaccine that uses mRNA technology. And then, like 5 minutes ago, the agency has now reversed course, saying it will review Moderna's application for its new flu vaccine. So we had this episode planned out about what this decision means and, like the original decision, whether or not it speaks to something larger about making vaccines in this moment. But now we're going to roll with the news of this big reversal. And the truth is, we're kind of still asking the same question, which is, what the heck is going on? This feels messy. On the one hand, doesn't this FDA have a point about setting a higher standard for approving vaccines that they're being asked to consider, no matter how chaotic it might look to us in the public? On the other hand, how are vaccine makers supposed to operate with all of this chaos? And even with the reversal, is this already having a chilling effect on vaccine makers? And how does this impact you at home? So a quick recap. Vinay Prasad, the FDA's top vaccine regulator and a key member of Secretary Kennedy's team, said that Moderna did not test its new vaccine against one of the strongest available vaccines. Moderna says it was caught off guard, that they had been told their study was adequate before the rug was pulled out from under them. So what does this chaotic story mean for mRNA vaccines? What does it mean for vaccines in general? Did the FDA's reversal come about because of science or politics? It is a midterm year. Our guest today is Ben Mazur, a physician who also writes for The Atlantic. Let's get started. Hey, welcome everyone.
Yeah, welcome.
So it's just Tom and me today. Maggie and Mark are off. They'll be back next time. We are thrilled to be joined in a moment by physician/journalist Ben Mazur, who writes for The Atlantic. Maybe he can help us get our heads around the news that the FDA has on again, off again. Will they, won't they, reverse course, and will now review Moderna's new mRNA flu vaccine application after its rather high-profile refusal to do that just a few days ago. So this episode for me is really an effort for me to really try to get my head around like what the heck is actually going on and why does any of this matter? Because it's really been in the sort of public health news arena lately. We're particularly focused on one man, Vinay Prasad, chief vaccine regulator at the FDA, who, according to reporting, personally intervened to refuse the application. Now, during the pandemic, Vinay Prasad was an outspoken critic of COVID vaccines, which were, of course, also mRNA based. I should also say that, like, he's not, I wouldn't go as far as calling him like anti-vax. He's pretty supportive of like measles vaccines and all those other kinds of vaccines out there. But during COVID, I would definitely put him in the category of like COVID dissident. And you'll recall just last month, it was Prasad that wrote an internal memo saying that the FDA had records showing that children were killed by COVID vaccines, and none of those records have been made public as yet. So
just to kind of set things up before Ben joins us, the idea here is just as, mRNA technology helped produce COVID vaccines in that record whirlwind amount of time back during the pandemic, Moderna wants to use the mRNA platform to create a flu vaccine. And they want to create one that has a higher likelihood of being a better match for each of our flu seasons that we have to muddle through. And, when it comes to this flu vaccine, the problem they're trying to solve for is that right now scientists have to select the strains to put into the vaccines roughly, call it 6 months before flu season even begins. They have to grow the virus in eggs or cell cultures to make that vaccine. And the hope is that the strains they put in the vaccine match, like into the kiln, come out, and they're actually a good match with what circulates in the flu season. But sometimes they get it wrong. Viruses mutate along the way, and the vaccine ends up being less effective. And it's worth noting, each year tens of thousands of Americans die from influenza. So the thinking now is mRNA is a faster way to make a vaccine. They just need to make those genetic instructions for the flu strain they're targeting. There's no more growing the virus in eggs or cell cultures for months. And maybe this could allow scientists to wait about 2 to 3 months longer before choosing which strain to cover with the vaccine, meaning they could have a better sense of what strain is brewing out there, which they'll target and hopefully end up with a more effective vaccine. Moderna started thinking about mRNA vaccine for flu back in 2015. It's obviously years before the pandemic when mRNA really came on
Hmm.
our public consciousness, which I thought was kind of cool and interesting. The current version of this has been in the works since 2021. So in 23 and 24, they worked with the FDA to design the trials, which they completed in mid 2025. So that's sort of the rough timeline here. And they plan to bring this new vaccine to market for our next flu season, starting this coming fall, winter. So after completing the final phase of its clinical trial, Moderna sent the FDA its application for approval, which, according to the company, says it shows the new vaccine is safe and effective. To Moderna's surprise, instead of advancing into this sort of approval stage, they instead received a letter, a refusal to file letter, which means the FDA was not going to read their application. And that was signed by Vinay Prasad. And he wrote a letter to the company saying that their study was not considered, quote, adequate and well controlled because Moderna had compared their new mRNA vaccine to a standard dose flu shot rather than what the agency described as the, quote, best available standard of care, which, according to them, is a higher dose vaccine, which right now is recommended for older adults. Moderna says that although the FDA had expressed to them a preference that they choose a higher dose vaccine as the comparison in their study, the agency indicated to them that the standard dose vaccine would be acceptable as well. After the news came out, after the company informed everybody that they got that refusal letter, Moderna president Stephen Hoge said the company invested almost $1 billion in this flu vaccine trial. And that, quote, I think it's obvious to all of us in the industry why many people would look at this and say, we can't continue to bring forward vaccines and new medicines. Then today, just as we were getting ready to tape it this morning, because it's Wednesday morning, the news broke that the FDA was, in fact, reversing course and will now review the flu vaccine's application. That's just 1 week after saying it wouldn't. And the CEO of Moderna put out a statement just now saying, we appreciate the FDA's engagement in a constructive Type A meeting and its agreement to advance our application for review. And that pending FDA approval, we look forward to making our flu vaccine available later this year so that America's seniors have access to a new option to protect themselves against the flu.
Okay. My head is officially spinning.
Spun.
Time to bring in Ben Mazer. Ben, who's waiting in the wings. Ben Mazer, surgical pathologist at Johns Hopkins, also a writer at The Atlantic, writes about health, and I'm waving around at all this. Ben Mazer, welcome to Why Should I Trust You?
Thanks for having me.
So, look, the first thing I want to tell our listeners is the reason we reached out to Ben is because as all of this was unfolding, I noticed Dr. Mazer had been posting on X. And one of the interesting things he posted was I'm going to read two posts. Okay, Ben? You said, quote, we need bigger changes to medical practice, including ethics approvals, guideline creation, insurance reimbursement. You go on and on about different changes we need that will incentivize drug companies to use the most informative control arms. But should a safe and effective therapy be banned? No. But then you go on to say, and this is what made me reach out and contact Ben. Quote, honestly, there has been too much pro-pharma focus on the critique of Vinay's decision. As a patient and doctor, I want multiple safe and effective options available. What if there's a shortage of one? I have an allergy or suffer side effects. Alternatives should be available. So, Ben, what did you mean when you say that there's too much pro-pharma focus on the critique of Vinay's decision, which, by the way, has now been reversed?
When I saw the news break, obviously the news cycle was driven by Moderna itself because these letters are private. So Moderna chose to release it, which is unusual in its own right. Companies tend to not want to have public beefs with the FDA because the FDA regulates them. They try to get along, right? So they were, going to war with the FDA publicly over this. And so obviously Moderna is framing it as bad for the industry, bad for themselves. And that's sort of how the narrative got propagated in the media, just because that's the way it was being presented, is that, how can companies invest in these long-term clinical trials if they don't have predictability, right? I mean, the background, which I think most people generally understand, is it takes a really long time to develop a new drug or vaccine, 10 or 15 years sometimes. And before you can, make a single dollar on it. And you have to invest all this money. And so, companies are rational. And why would they invest all this money if they don't think they can predict whether or not they're going to get a return on investment? And so, that's a valid enough argument. I think, we want innovative new therapies, but it's probably the most beneficial argument for the FDA side, because I don't think that many people are particularly sympathetic to drug companies not making enough money. Like, they make enough money. That's not the big issue.
Yeah, and I want to come back to sort of that part of it. But before we get into that, let's talk about the FDA side. So the company says back in August, they specifically asked the agency about the data. Like you had said, they'd collected from the clinical trial. And when they asked the FDA if they would review it, the FDA said yes. The company acknowledges that they were told the agency's preference was that they test this new vaccine against a higher dose vaccine, which, like, some people over 65 use. The company did that study, but it wasn't the main study they relied on in their application. So was that kind of dumb, or like, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think, the background of this is that there's kind of like multiple wars going on right now. There's people with, multiple agendas, and they're kind of like allies of convenience when it comes to vaccines. You obviously, at the top of the healthcare administration, have RFK Jr., Robert Kennedy Jr., who is a ardent anti-vaccine activist, right? But Vinay Prasad, who, I've followed and known for a long time personally, and Marty Makary to some degree, have a different agenda. They're not, I don't think they're anti-vaccine at all. They're what we would call evidence-based medicine hardliners, which is a little bit closer to what I fall into. That's why we got along for so long. And, they've had complaints about FDA approvals, for many, many years. Vinay built his career on this and published hundreds of papers on this. And this issue in particular has drawn his ire, which is inferior control arms. So, when you run a clinical trial, you have your experimental drug, and then you have something you compare it to. And if there's no other drug available, it's usually like some kind of placebo. But if there's already like a standard of care, you compare it to the standard of care to try to see if it's at least as good as the standard of care, if not better. And this is done all the time. And drug companies have a history of picking control arms that they claim are standard of care, but are actually not, and are kind of inferior. And this has been a huge deal in cancer clinical trials, which is, the area that Vinay is in as an oncologist, and I'm in as a oncologic pathologist. We mostly deal with cancer, and it's been a huge issue. Chemotherapy regimens, all these things. Cancer is very complicated to treat, right? It's not like a vaccine where it's like there's a flu vaccine and you get the flu vaccine, right? There's dozens and dozens of cancer drugs that are done in all sorts of different combinations, and so it's easy to trick to sort of tweak the system so that it makes your drug look a little better. You don't use the most effective chemotherapy in the control arm, and so your drug by default looks a little better, if that makes any sense. And it's a game they play. And Vinay Prasad has been pointing this out for years, that it's a way to make your experimental drug look better than it is. And newer drugs, right, are more expensive. They're harder to get. Newer isn't necessarily better in medicine because things are so expensive already. And people have to learn how to use it. And there's a lot you don't know about new drugs versus one you've used for 50 years.
But Ben, is the standard of care for a flu vaccine, just educate us here, is it not the regular dose vaccine? Isn't that what most American adults get? Or when we use that phrase standard of care, like, does that mean this is the best, most powerful vaccine we have? Like, how are we supposed to wrestle with that? Because it seems to be pretty key here in terms of whether this study was a solid, good study, or one that was trying to, like you say, put its new product up against maybe not the greatest product, so your new product looks better.
Yeah, I mean, all this to say about the chemotherapy drugs is it's extremely complicated, and flu shots are not that complicated, right? I
Okay.
mean, so that's the issue, and I think that's where, Dr. Prasad fell on his face a little, because he picked something that really is something that people can understand a lot better. Most of us just get a standard dose flu shot. There's different companies that make slightly different formulations, but we kind of lump them all together. Like, when you go get a flu shot, you don't tend to know what brand you're getting or consider it. It's not like, Apple versus Android. Like, it's just like you get a flu shot, even though there's a few different companies that make it, and someone my age, I won't tell you how old I am. Older by the day. We still get the standard dose flu shot. I get that every year, which is what it was compared against. So yeah, when you say standard of care, like it's the shot I get every year, so it can't be that crazy. It's FDA approved. It's given to millions and millions of people. The nuance is that basically a couple of years ago, the Vaccine Advisory Committee, which you are now familiar with, I know you interviewed the new chair of it. Back when it was like a sort of real thing, it recommended that seniors 65 and older get the high dose flu shot. So it's basically just like, a higher dose of the standard flu shot. It's a different product. On the idea that it would work a little better for seniors because their immune system's weaker, they need a stronger dose. So that's a pretty recent recommendation in the US. I mean, that recommendation came out, I don't know the exact date, but it's like roughly a year before Moderna did their trial. So it's not like this has been something that's been going on for 50 years and Moderna just ignored it. This was, you could argue, a new recommendation that was established, but it was new. I mean, and the point being that the whole world doesn't follow this. Not everywhere uses high dose flu shots. Some use standard flu shots. So what is the standard of care? In plenty of countries, they just use standard. And the actual recommendation is that get the high dose flu shot if it's available at, like, you go to the pharmacy to get your shot or your doctor's office or whatever it is, you're over 65. If the high dose is available, pick that. If it's not, just get the regular one. Because, again, back when the Vaccine Advisory Committee was real, it considered practical things, right? And if you go to get your shot and you don't get it and you say, oh, I'll come back later for a different one, you're like never going to come back. I mean, that's just like they're trying to be practical. Getting any flu shot is going to be a lot better than getting no flu shot. And so, while most seniors now in the US get the high dose flu shot, plenty still get the standard dose. I mean, it's like something like 20%. So,
Right.
it's
Right.
FDA approved. It's not crazy. I think probably the drug company has explanations for why they did this, right? They say it was more practical because they were running it in multiple countries and not every country has high dose flu shots. And, every time a drug company games the clinical trial, they have a reason. They don't say like we're cheating. They don't write that in their
Yeah.
regulatory documents. They have a reason, and it's often, there's obviously a piece of truth there. You're not allowed to just fabricate stuff, but you can imagine that this was in the back of their heads. This is not a
Yeah.
new thing, that it gives us an extra, it juices the trial a little bit.
Before
It's
we
still a legitimate trial, but it juices
It
it.
juices a little bit. Yeah, exactly. It puts their best foot forward. Before we get into sort of what is going on here with this reversal, I just want to push you to make the best case argument for Prasad and what he did here. I mean, we had an election, people wanted change, a new HHS is here, they're disruptive. They, point to the old systems are not working, sort of in every which way you look when it comes to health and health policy. Like, doesn't he have the right to say, however chaotic this may seem, I am doing what I think is best for the American public, and that means holding, these vaccines that you bring before me to approve, we're going to hold them to a higher account. Now, it should have been clear at the outset or back in August, but you know what? I've got that right, and I've got that prerogative, and I've got that responsibility to make that call. Like, is there something to that?
Yeah, I think, the way we are interpreting both this event and then, other decisions he's made as a regulator is highly influenced by the background politics of it. And you could imagine the public reaction by experts, at least, and downstream of that, the public who's, listening to what experts bloviate on about, it could have been very different in a very different political context, right? We have Donald Trump, we have RFK Jr., RFK Jr. being this huge vaccine skeptic. And so everything is interpreted under the lens of these are anti-vaccine decisions. These are people who hate vaccines and just are looking for any reason not to approve one, because I think that's a valid interpretation of Kennedy's agenda. Prasad is not like that, and he's sort of enacting real policy changes he's been advocating for many years. And you can imagine if he got stuck in a different administration, a more conventional administration, a lot of doctors like myself would be cheering on what he's doing. Because I think, pre-pandemic, he had a lot of sympathizers. Again, I was one of them, that said he's a bit of a hardliner, but he's making very valid points that, like, you need someone, right? Like, you need someone on one side of an issue to raise the salience of it, to say, like, you got to stop doing this. This is hurting people. It's approving worthless, expensive drugs that, are bankrupting. He used to talk about it's bankrupting the healthcare system. And he's not wrong about that. I don't know what the flu shot's going to cost. It'll probably cost more than a regular conventional flu shot. And of course, other drugs cost way more than that. So in a different administration, doctors like me would be cheering him on, but instead people are interpreting him in the least favorable light. So I do have a bit of sympathy for him, actually, to be honest. The issue is FDA approval isn't supposed to mean that everyone's supposed to use the drug and everyone's supposed, and every insurer is supposed to pay for it. We have a very fragmented healthcare system in this country, which is very unlike Europe. And each regulatory agency has a different role. And the FDA isn't supposed to set prices. They're not supposed to set the standard of care, for doctors like me and what decisions we make. They're not supposed to set insurance reimbursement or whatever. Clinical guidelines are written by doctors, not by the FDA. And so the role of the FDA in theory is to have drugs reach a certain bar, safe and effective. And then everything after that is supposed to be up to other people. And so the FDA has always said, like, we approve it. It may not be the best drug out there, but it's an option. It meets a certain bar, right? It's not useless. It's not incredibly dangerous. We sort of understand what its benefits and risks are and can describe it to patients and doctors. And then it's up to doctors to decide if they want to prescribe it. No one has to give this flu shot in theory. And insurers could say, we don't want to cover it. We think the cheaper stuff works better just as well, so we're not going to pay for it. So that's the theory. In reality, that's not the way it works, because there's just so many competing political agendas, right? Patients want access to new and innovative therapies, and pharma companies support those patient groups. And so patients will advocate for the newest drugs available, no matter how weak it is, right? We saw that. I wrote about years ago, and I think I interviewed Vinay Prasad actually for the article. It's when we were still on speaking terms. And, about the new Alzheimer's drug that the FDA approved very controversially because it really didn't show much benefit, and the FDA still approved it. And, the FDA's argument is, well, you don't have to give it, but everyone sort of knows, like, there's no good treatments for Alzheimer's. People are desperate. Patients were demanding it. This could bankrupt insurance companies, because that one was hundreds of thousands of dollars. It was, very expensive. And obviously a lot of people, unfortunately, have Alzheimer's. So, it was becoming a huge deal. And this was all, pre-RFK. This was something where I think the mainstream of medicine was on the side of Vinay Prasad and allies, that this was being too liberal. And once drugs are approved, they sort of just make their way into clinical practice, Mm-hmm. And so you have to, the only way to stop it is to have the FDA put their foot down, because that's a hard stop, right? If the FDA doesn't approve a drug, you can't use it. It's, that's the only hard stop in a very broken system. And so I think a lot of people would be cheering on Vinay Prasad using that hard stop to say, this is the way we're going to enforce tighter standards. We're going to use our power, the bully pulpit, and the little regulatory power we have to say, to demand the pharmaceutical companies change course. So, I think that's the pro-administration perspective on this. So,
but it's not a boy who cried wolf situation is the point. Like, this is for real.
It's a real issue, but it's not the best example. There are just so many more egregious examples. Like, to be honest, this flu shot is going to be an incremental benefit. And it may not, you have to look at the details. Like, it may not be all that much of a benefit at all. The big thing, was obviously a huge advocate for the COVID vaccines, right? I wrote, dozens of articles about it. And, the COVID vaccines, especially for older people, were just life-saving. But we saw, right, they don't last forever. You need boosters. They don't prevent infection. Respiratory viruses are hard to create vaccines against, and nothing's changed with that. Like, this isn't some miracle flu shot that you take once and you're never going to get the flu. It's got the same problems as conventional flu shots, in that it only works to a certain degree, and we're kind of guessing to some degree how much it's going to keep you out of the hospital. So we know from the studies, and we know this from like conventional and the mRNA flu shots, that it'll help prevent your chance of getting an infection. You'll be less likely to get an infection, which is good, of course. But if you get a mild flu for a couple of days, no one thinks that's the end of the world. People are really trying to prevent, especially in older people, ending up in the hospital or dying from this. And you can't run a study big enough on that very easily before a drug is approved. And so we don't actually know, does this new mRNA shot keep people out of the hospital? It's reasonable to guess that it probably will, which is what we guessed for conventional flu shots. And frankly, we're still sorting that out today. How many hospitalizations and deaths are prevented by your conventional flu shots? We give it to, billions of people all around the world. We believe in these, but we don't really have a great sense of like exactly how many people are they keeping out of the hospital. It's just so hard to study. And so you're going to have the same questions with this new flu shot. The supposed benefit is that you can adjust the strains sooner, or sooner to the time of the seasonal outbreak. And so you can match the strains better, and that'll make the shot more effective. This wasn't actually studied in the trial. This is an assumption. So it may not be true, but it's a reasonable assumption, but it's a guess. So that's an issue. And then the other one is that, assuming you guys have gotten these mRNA shots, I've gotten a bunch of them from COVID, you get a lot of side effects from these shots. These are what we say reactogenic, right? Like, I get a flu shot every year. I feel like nothing. Especially after getting the COVID shots. I got my COVID shots for all those years, and then I got my flu shot a few months ago, and I'm like, what is this wimpy shot? Like, this is nothing. Like, my arm is like a little bit sore for like an hour. When I get the COVID shots, and again, everyone's a little different, but when I would get the COVID shots, I was like sick on my back for 2 days. It honestly, it felt like the flu for me, and some people had it worse. Some people had it less. My parents never got any side effects from the COVID shot. And so, they never complained. I complained, but so everyone's different.
In saying that, I think, look, it's worth pointing out a big part of our listener audience are big fans of Kennedy. They're Maha supporters. They listen to our show. And I think the mRNA vaccine is considered a bad vaccine by many of this community. And, I think that swirling around all of this is this narrative around mRNA technology, right? And look, we've done plenty of episodes of where we kind of go through how it all works and all that. But I guess my question is, and just now even forgetting about the FDA, like the flu part of it, what is your take on how, as a society, we should be approaching mRNA-based vaccines? Because there is a problem of trust in this technology right now. And some of it, of course, we can say is being deliberately kind of imposed by bad faith actors. Or are you sort of in that firm camp of like, this is all misinformation and wrong? Or is there a part of this that's like, well, we should be investing in all kinds of technologies right now. This is just one of them. And maybe we do need to look into it a little bit further.
Yeah. It's really tough because there is a lot of just misinformation, right? I've written about, there's this whole idea of like turbo cancers, and the mRNA vaccines cause turbo cancer. That couldn't be further from the truth. Some of the craziest stuff is just untrue. But at core of it is, my view, and I've honestly been critical of mRNA vaccines more than most conventional medical journalists. I've written quite a few critical things about them. It's a mediocre technology that was perfectly fit for the COVID moment, right? The COVID moment was this brand new, seriously deadly virus that we hadn't dealt with before. And we needed we needed a really fast vaccine available, right? We needed to be able to develop it quickly, produce it quickly, distribute it quickly. I mean, never in the history of pandemics have we tried to vaccinate our way out of it. That has never been done before. I mean, flu pandemics, I suppose, but like in the sense of like a new virus, like one that, flu pandemics are still flu. We vaccinate for flu every year. But I mean, like, we didn't try to do this for SARS-1, Ebola, it took a long time to develop vaccines for. It took decades. Other things, we still don't have HIV vaccines. I mean, the idea that before this rapidly transmissible virus infects everyone, like we all knew this thing was like getting out, right? I mean, this thing is COVID and it kept mutating to get more and more infectious. Like the idea that we're going to beat that by getting a vaccine out before the virus gets everywhere is kind of crazy. And we did it. I mean, we really did. It took obviously a lot of social effort and there were social restrictions to slow the virus down. But the mRNA technology allowed us to develop the vaccine and produce the vaccine and distribute the vaccine very quickly. It wasn't the only technology, right? We had adenovirus vector vaccines used in Europe, which seemed to work, just as well. So it wasn't the only technology.
You don't see the mRNA platform like being a natural fit for flu, or you don't see the mRNA platform being a natural fit to sort of stimulate the body's response to cancer? Like,
it's not going to be great for respiratory infections, for like your boosters, your annual boosters. We see that with COVID, and I think we're going to see that with flu, is that, COVID boosters in nowadays just don't do very much. They probably, they have a small benefit, and we kind of target them at the highest risk people because it's worth it. But the fact that you need a booster every year is a failure in a sense, right? You don't need that for the measles vaccine. And so it's not going to change the game of respiratory viruses. People are talking about it with cancer. We'll have to see. I think that's so much earlier in development. I'd love to see it, and I won't speculate. But respiratory viruses, it's not changing the game.
If you were in charge of HHS, you wouldn't have cut the federal funding for research into mRNA.
No,
right.
Absolutely not. I mean, that was a political decision, but I think the point being that, and I've written this, actually, I've written this years ago, that if we're going to have, mRNA does not seem to me as a non-vaccinologist, as just a doctor, like it's going to be the technology that solves our respiratory virus problem. Like if we want good flu shots, COVID shots, whatever respiratory virus vaccines, we need a different technology.
So is that because it mutates so rapidly, or like why good, why not?
Some of it's the mutation. And then the other one is that it doesn't deliver the antibodies to the right location, right? So it's really good at producing blood antibodies. But the antibodies you really need to fight respiratory infections are actually in your nose and your mouth, your mucosa. And so it's not good at producing antibodies where you need them.
When you saw the news of the rejection to review this and you saw that it was mRNA based, did you think, there's a dollop of politics in this? There's a population supports this HHS. They do not like mRNA sort of in any form. Did you think that factored in, or did you really see this as something else?
I think this is sort of allies of convenience. I think Vinay Prasad wanted to put his foot down on an evidence standard and chose mRNA because of this administration, because he knew he could get away with it. RFK is not coming to the defense of mRNA vaccines, right? And a lot of the constituents aren't coming to defense of that. And so he thought this was an easy one he could pick, because actually, this is not the first time Vinay Prasad has done this, right? And he's been fired and rehired already. Ruined an article. I wrote an article about him getting fired, and then he got hired a week later. So, ruined that article. But the point of the article I wrote, and it's still true, is that he tried to put his foot down on rare disease drugs, right? That's also his purview, vaccines and kind of.
And he's done it with a bunch of those, right?
Yeah. And that faced a lot of pushback. And he had arguments for those too, in the sense that they hadn't proven how effective these drugs are. The difference is that it's very hard to prove it for rare diseases because it's hard to collect enough data. They're rare diseases, So there's an argument on both sides, but the fact that we couldn't say exactly how effective these drugs were, and they certainly had some side effects, is reasonable enough. But when he put his foot down on those, that was a political maelstrom, right? It got him fired. I mean, and then they had to beg Macri had to beg the administration to get his job back. So that was a failure, right? When he tried to put his foot down on evidence before, there were just too many constituencies who supported these drugs. And I think he thought mRNA, he could get away with it. And, I guess he couldn't. But I think that was the assumption. He's just, he's got a different agenda.
One of the things you hear a lot in this administration is the idea of, just completely changing everything, right? And this idea of disruption, you like Jay Bhattacharya talks about a second scientific revolution. You've got Vinay Prasad, and in this case, you talked about the disruption of the idea of inferior control arms, and he's talked about all these other things, the replication crisis, all of this stuff. And my question is there a positive case to be made that some of these things, being a priority of this administration, to really look at how a weirdly incentivized scientific exploration process that we have in this country is in fact, like, they are asking important questions from their position of power. It's gotten, mixed up with the political priorities of a man and a president who want to, kind of bulldoze their way and like doge their way out of everything or get rid of vaccines and things like that. But ultimately, there are people like whether it's Bhattacharya, Prasad, McCary, others that for years have been questioning certain ways that science operates in America. And do you think that kind of in the olden days, like before this administration, those same questions were being asked and explored in the same way? Like, are these, I guess the question I'm asking, Ben, in a really like clunky way, is that like, do these guys have a point? Like, do these questions actually need to be asked? Is there a problem with the way we explore science in this country right now?
Yeah, they do have a point. And I think they had the liberal perspective until this administration. This is what, academic doctors all talked about in private. Like, this is what they published on. This is what we talked about. We were all in agreement on these issues. And, the truth is, like, most academic physicians are liberal, not all of them, but it's a more liberal, it's not a Trumpy culture. And so here we are sitting and talking about the same issues that they're now trying to address. And I think to me, what's fascinating is, you have all these people that were calling for major change. I mean, Prasad has been calling for major changes, Macri, other people, and now they're in a position to try to do them. And we're getting a sense of like, why there hasn't been major change, because there's always a lot of explanations because these guys are scientists and they've published a lot of empirical proof of these problems. Like, this isn't speculation. Like, there is data showing that we are proving ineffective, unsafe, expensive drugs. Like, I think these guys put, their nose to the grindstone and produced good research showing that over many years. And so the question is, why hasn't the FDA acted on that? And there's a bunch of different potential explanations. The RFK conspiracy cynical side is that they're corrupt, right? They're bought out by industry. There's this revolving door. They don't want to piss off the drug companies because they want to go work for the drug companies after they leave. And so it's just pure and simple corruption, conflict of interest, sort of the most nefarious perspective you could have on this. And that's one thing. That's obviously not what people at the FDA say. They don't talk about how they're sitting here corrupt and evil. They talk about how there's practical considerations. There's investment considerations, right? You do need drug companies to be able to invest money. And there's a balance between patients who want access to the latest technology and patients who want the most proven safe and effective drugs. And there's people in the public, there's constituencies, real patients on both sides of this, right? If you are dying of something really severe and untreatable, you are willing to take risks, right? You're willing to say, I don't want to wait 30 years for the world's best evidence. I'm dying right now, And so you have this balance because you also don't want to give these people snake oil. I don't think anyone wants to take something that doesn't work. So the FDA's argument has been that they're trying to strike a balance, right? Give people access to things sooner while still collecting enough evidence to show that it works. And then, the other argument is that it's a big bureaucratic agency, and anything in government takes a while to change because there's a process to things. And I think that's the part that's pissed people off the most, is that because it's like the least sexy argument is like, you have to follow a process with things, right? You have to put out a proposal. You have to let the industry and patients publicly comment on it. There's a comment period for months. You have to revise it based on those comments. Then you have to issue a final one. Then there's litigation, and it takes years to change regulations. That's just how the government works. And so here you've got these people who have always hated this, just trying to blow past it, just saying like, screw the old process. Let's just change it tomorrow. Why not? Right? Like, instead, what Prasad could have done was put what we say, promulgated new regulations. The FDA has guidance for industry to say, here's how you should run a vaccine clinical trial, 50 or 100-page document that says, here's how you should do it. Our general recommendations before you design the trial. He could have updated that document and said, okay, we're changing, how we want to do things, and we're going to update it. And that happens all the time. That's the normal way to do things. Instead, he decided to make an example of Moderna and just say, we're changing it tomorrow, today, even though the guidance hasn't officially changed yet. And I think he's realizing, and I think a lot of the administration is realizing, that there's a reason this isn't done. And it's not because people in the agency don't want to fix things. There's laws, there's standards, there's public backlash, there's, politics. There's a reason you don't just blow up the system. And it's not because people are evil necessarily.
They don't want to promulgate.
No, Ben, they don't.
So just now to the reversal. Obviously, the decision was made inside the FDA that this was untenable. So I want to give you a multiple choice. Was it untenable scientifically? Was it untenable business-wise, or untenable politically? Or we could give you all of the above. We don't know why they reversed, but where's your instinct here as to what's going on?
I'm sure politics has something to do with it. If I were Vinay Prasad and I'd already been fired once, I might be thinking about my job a little bit, because, he's already on thin ice. It's pretty weird to get fired and then come back. But no, I think it's not just politics. I think they probably, people are making fun of me for like legally speculating, because obviously I'm not a lawyer, and people are joking. It's like, doctors think they're experts at everything. But if RFK can play doctor, I don't see why I can't play lawyer. Obviously not legal advice.
Speculate. Permission to speculate.
But as someone who writes about health policy, I have a working knowledge of this. And there's something called the Administrative Procedure Act, which has a standard, and the administration has been constantly losing. They lost in the first Trump era, and they seem to be losing now with what RFK is doing. Is that there is a requirement for things to not be arbitrary and capricious. So by law, they have to follow a process.
So you think they could have been scared of being sued?
I think they opened themselves up to a lawsuit. There's a reason you do it this way, because that's the legal way. And actually, when RFK first started doing his anti-vaccine stuff, I was really impressed with him, because he's a very smart lawyer, and he seemed to be following the rules very carefully in a way to protect himself from lawsuits, right? What he was doing, he reconstituted ACIP, right? The Vaccine Advisory Committee, which is his prerogative. And then was and his hand-picked scientists were then going to vote on vote in a way he clearly was going to be in favor of. But that's the way you do it, right? You pick experts who are going to agree with you. Then those experts have deliberations. Then they vote. And that's a process. And you can criticize it, but you can show a paper trail. That's the point. You can show a paper trail.
He skipped that with the biggest change to the vaccine schedule.
And he got immediately sued for it. Yeah. And I think he's going to be in trouble. Whereas the other stuff, he was much more on firmer ground. Right. I don't know what made him change, what the deal of that. Maybe he got bored. Maybe he thought he could get away with it. Maybe he just wanted to move faster, or he didn't think the committee was going to give him everything he wanted. That's pure speculation. But I went from very impressed with what he was doing to he's going the normal Trump route, which is just like blow it up.
Just do it.
And I think, I think there's absolutely legal considerations.
Does the reversal change the climate again for vaccine makers in this country? Because there was a lot of the sky's falling, vaccine makers are pulling out. They can't operate in this sort of crazy climate where you don't know if what you're putting forward is going to get even looked at, and people are changing the terms. Like, does the reversal ease some of that, or was that not a real thing to begin with?
I mean, it's a real thing, but I think no one's blind. Like they know who the Secretary of Health and Human Services is. The country's most notorious anti-vaccine activist is head of the healthcare system. I don't think vaccine manufacturers are blind to that, and I don't think they were particularly encouraged to be developing new vaccine technologies already. Like, I don't think this is going to make a big practical difference because RFK is still in charge and everyone knows which way the wind is blowing. What I will point out to pivot a little bit is that this whole gold standard science and trying to make things more rigorous has been very selective on vaccines. You know, that the critiques that people like Prasad and Macri have been making have not been centered on vaccines historically. They've been centered on, like we talked about, cancer drugs, drugs for rare diseases, all sorts of other therapeutics that were not vaccines. Frankly, you know, Prasad didn't care about vaccines before he wanted to get a job in this administration. He cared about other kinds of drugs, and the FDA has not taken the same hardline approach with the whole other world of therapies out there. In fact, it's the opposite. Macri, who's been critical of evidence too, has been very pro pharma. You know, people weren't sure which way he was going to go because he, in some sense, he's been very business friendly. He's worked for pharmaceutical companies, talking about the revolving door. He's made plenty of money on the board of directors of pharmaceutical companies before this. You know, but he's also been critical of pharmaceutical companies. So people weren't sure which way he was going to go. And I think now, a year later, or however many months later, we can see RFK is a pro pharma commissioner, which frankly, a lot of them have been. It's not that different. And so he's making it easier for people to get drugs approved, making it less evidence. You know, one big example, which didn't make the news, but is frankly more earth-shattering than this, was historically the FDA required 2 positive clinical trials to approve a drug. So you run 2 trials. They both have to show the drug is safe and effective. You do that because you want to see it works in different scenarios. The first one wasn't a fluke, right? You run it in one country or one population, then you run it in another. It kind of gives you more confidence. But of course, that doubles the cost because you have to run 2 trials. He when he got into office, he announced they're changing that, and you only need 1 trial, right? That is less evidence. That is less confidence, and that's something I am pretty sure, based on my reading of you know, his work, Vinay Prasad would have been totally opposed to. In fact, I'm pretty sure he's been opposed to it in the past publicly. You know, I think when this first came up, I found stuff he'd written, you know, criticizing this idea before he got in the administration, and now he's a part of it. You know, that is a pro pharma political position. Where they're not taking that pro pharma approach is in vaccines, and I think we know why, because who's in charge.
Yeah, and I don't think people necessarily are, like you saying, RFK is a pro pharma secretary of HHS. I don't think people think of it like that. It's quite the opposite, right? Pharma's the demon, pharma's the bad guy. But you're saying a lot of drugs are being pushed through the pipeline with perhaps a lower standard, a lower hurdle to cross in order to get them into our health environment to make people healthier. Is that
Well,
like
also,
that's
I'll just add to that, Ben, and I'm curious if because I kind of think that 2 things are happening, right? I think you just laid out a really great point, but at the same time, when you cancel $500 million in mRNA technology, and you also kind of put in so much suspicion around mRNA and vaccines in general, aren't you also doing just the opposite of building up your kind of like what you said about pharma?
Yeah, I mean, he's poisoning the well with mRNA. Let's say we don't know how well these things are going to work for cancer, which I think is what everyone's big hope is that it's going to produce effective cancer therapies. Let's say it does. Are people going to take it? Like, I think we have a lot of valid concerns about public trust. This is not helping. Like, you know, some mRNA cancer therapy comes out that's miraculous or amazing or wonderful. Is anyone even going to be willing to take it? And that's a real question. and a problem because they've completely poisoned the well for mRNA, aggressively and intentionally. But when it comes to the other stuff, this may shock you, but I think as a politician, RFK is being a little hypocritical. Like, I think they're being hypocritical politicians. I think they're saying one thing to the public and another thing to drug companies, which is always the way it's worked. It's run of the mill as much as it's not, it's not revolutionary. It's par for the course. Like, he's going out and he's certainly saying a lot of bad things about drug companies, and then he's giving them most of what they want in private, because the drug companies are politically powerful. That has always been a valid critique. They are influential to Congress and to the president and to everything else. And there is a revolving door. And so I think he's giving the drug companies a lot of what they want to save his own job, So I think it's rank hypocrisy. And I think it's quite funny, actually. Because, I think RFK believes a lot of this stuff about drug companies being evil. I don't think he's, I think he misrepresents data, but I think at his heart, he believes a lot of the stuff he's fighting for. And I think he's being a total political opportunist here. And that's, whatever, that's my opinion. But I think he's giving the drug companies what they want so he keeps his job.
Ben Mazur on Why Should I Trust You? Always, you have juicy, spicy takes on things. We want you to come back to our show, Ben. Will you do that? Did you have fun?
Yeah, sure. That was fun.
Thank you so much for joining us.
I don't know if anyone's still listening now that we've just talked about the FDA for an hour. But I've been waiting about 10 years to talk about the FDA, so you got me.
I'll tell you, the things that our listeners like to listen to always really surprise me. We just did a whole episode about monoclonal antibodies, and we just got really into the thick of it. So just nerd away. You have full permission to nerd out on our show. That was Ben Mazur. I am Brenda Adhikari. He is Tom Johnson. That is Why Should I Trust You? Maggie and Mark will be back with us on our next episode. Thank you for listening. We'll see you back here next week.